I'm going to talk today to you about using this SAMHSA framework, SBIRT, S-B-I-R-T, Screening, Brief Intervention, Referral to Treatment for Youth Suicide. And like all of our talks lately, unfortunately, we're going to skew them towards all the unique aspects of what we need to do during a pandemic. Just a little bit of background next. Is no financial interest, nothing to disclose, next. And this is a little bit about me, but one of the things that's pertinent here is that I was the co-principal investigator for the 2 5-year SBIRT grants that New Mexico had. And it was focused on 18 plus for people who had substance abuse. This is the typical focus of SBIRT. I was really lucky to be blessed with state support and colleagues who expanded that in our second 5-year grant to look at suicidality, trauma, anxiety, and mood disorders as they related to people who had suffered from substance abuse. So I have direct experience using suicide prevention screening, universal screening through the SBIRT framework to identify people at risk for self-harm, people at risk for suicidality, and people at risk for developing post-traumatic stress disorder, mood disorders, etc. Next slide. I think that's in the reverse direction. There we go. Back to the objectives, Felicia. I think that's, there we go. So what I'm hoping that you'll get from this is the key principles of SBIRT, what that framework actually means. It's not a therapy, it's sort of like a protocol or a template where you do different things, and how to look at suicidality through that SBIRT framework, how to make that work for you, and the benefits and the challenges in supporting all of those around us in our community. And the other thing to mention is that in the second SBIRT grant, I created a major clinical role for peer support workers. That and other things that I and a lot of my colleagues in the state did ended up resulting in a peer support worker certification program. And eventually, recently, Medicaid will pay for SBIRT services performed by peer support workers. So unlike most funding for peer support workers, it's direct funding from the state and federal government for your services. So it's very important that we look at the interdisciplinary team. Next slide. So this is just a bit about my program that I've created for Office of School and Adolescent Health. The important thing for you to know is that it's a strength-based, resiliency-based suicide prevention program that's very collaborative and directed by peers. Next. I like to start with this slide because a number of suicide prevention national organizations commissioned a poll a few years ago. It's relatively recent, where they interviewed thousands of people and demonstrated, contrary to the myth, that 94% of those people who were polled believe that suicide can be prevented, and the same group of people, the same significant majority of people said if they had tools that they could use, they would want to help people who were thinking about suicide. So this idea that nobody notices it, nobody talks about it, people feel hopeless about preventing it, is not at all the case. Next slide. So a little bit about youth. It's been the second leading cause of death for that age group for some time. Next slide. And this is really important for our colleagues in primary care, in emergency departments, urgent care, is that people who are at risk of suicide much more often see our friends in primary care rather than behavioral health care. So if you look at this, 50% of people who die by suicide had contact with primary care providers in the month prior to suicide. These are people who kill themselves, not people who have suicidal ideation or attempts. 80% of people who die by suicide had contact in the year prior to death. Only 20% of people who die by suicide saw a behavioral health provider within the month before they died. So that's why connecting to the larger community of care is really important. Next slide. And to put a fine point on it, SBIRT is intended to deliver substance abuse services and through the expansion that I talked about, mental health services in primary care, urgent care, and emergency department settings, rather than traditional behavioral health settings, to capture these folks and hopefully prevent them from taking their own life. This won't surprise you. The comorbidity with suicide is very high. More than 90% of people who die by suicide have either a severe mental disorder or a substance use disorder or both. Next slide. So I like to go through these myths primarily because if you want to help people at risk for suicide, these myths make it impossible to connect to them. So if someone is really suicidal, they're going to kill themselves no matter what you do. Asking a depressed person about suicide puts the idea in their heads where it never was before. There's no point in asking about suicidal thoughts. If someone's going to do it, they won't tell you. Someone making suicidal threats won't really do it. They are looking for attention. If you stop someone from killing themselves one way, they'll find another. Our understanding for decades, all across the world, in millions of people, is none of these myths have any remote semblance to the truth. So the idea about they're going to kill themselves at some point no matter what you do, 95% plus of people who survive a near fatal attempt do not make a future attempt. 95%. Ask a depressed person about suicide. People who are having suicidal ideation are actually relieved to be able to talk about it in hopes they might stop themselves from doing something. There is no evidence at all that somebody never thought of suicide until a caring person asked them about it. There's no point in asking if someone's going to do it, they won't tell you. That is only true for people who have chronic, severe, debilitating, treatment-resistant depression. They've tried everything under the sun, nothing helps. And I always compare it to, I've worked with children with cancer for all of my career, and we have an understanding now for people who are suffering from a terminal illness with great suffering and discomfort, that there may be a point for euthanasia. This is what people feel, is that suicide is the only answer to end their sufferings because they've really tried everything. And so they don't tell people that they're suicidal and they're hopeless about what to do, because if they do, they know that they'll be committed and forced to continue to suffer. So that's a very, very small group of people and not in youth at all. Someone making threats won't really do it. They're just seeking for attention. Those of you who know me know that this is a big bugaboo of mine. Everyone seeks attention. That's how we care for each other. That's how we attend to each other, is to care. So saying someone does something for attention is very counterproductive, very stigmatizing. And if we're looking at preventing death, we'd much rather have people over-report feeling suicidal than under-report, and then we can't help them. If you stop someone from killing themselves one way, they'll find another. Again, not true. Next. So I'm not going to belabor what a suicide attempt is. I'm sure that you all know that. It's any kind of action that you take in order to, in your own mind, end your life. And the reason I emphasize in your own mind is we have people who think, for instance, that a few sleeping pills are fatal. So they may be dismissed as not being, quote, truly suicidal because their belief is that something is lethal when it's not. But their intent is that they're going to die by what they do. So they're at very high risk. The opposite can be true of someone who thinks, well, you know, 1 or 2 sleeping pills isn't working for me. I should take 5 or 6. And then they end up having respiratory arrest and they're near death. They had no intention to die. They were trying to get to sleep, or they were trying to take pain medication and it wasn't cutting it, so they took more and then they overdosed unintentionally. So one thing I do want to emphasize is that most people about most things are ambivalent. They feel very strongly in one direction, very strongly in another, and they vacillate between the two. So it's always helpful to say, what part of you felt this way? What part of you felt that way? And how is that different from where it was an hour ago, a couple of hours ago? So some people might be in the moment profoundly hopeless and wanting to die, but just an hour ago felt very differently because of something that just happened within that hour. Next. So the suicide inquiry is a series of questions to focus on ideas, wishes, plans, behaviors, and intent. One thing I always like to point out here is the difference between an aborted and an interrupted attempt. Aborted means that I'm starting to take pills and I decide I don't want to go through with it. So I stop the attempt before it continues. Interrupted means that I work in an office with Felicia. I know that typically she's out of the office at 10 o'clock to 12. So I time it at 11:45, knowing on some level that she'll probably walk in 15 minutes later and stop me. That is really an aborted attempt. Now, if I deliberately did it at 10 o'clock, knowing that I had at least 2 hours before she's likely to appear, and she shows up earlier than I anticipate, then she interrupted my attempt. So this is all a way of saying that that informs us a lot about how strong that planning was and how strong the intent to die was. So I'll give you an example of something that recently happened where I was talking to a bunch of your colleagues at one of the schools presenting about suicide prevention, and we were told that a student in an empty classroom had made a serious attempt. This student had been chronically suicidal, knew that the classroom was empty for a limited period of time, that a lot of people were going to be going back and forth in the corridor and find that person. And so even though it seemed as if it was a very deliberate attempt to be in a place where no one would find them, when they were interrupted, they really said that that was part of their intent. They wanted to let everybody know how much they were suffering, and they were very hopeful that people would stop their attempts. So again, that really tells us about what their level of intent to die is. Next. So now we're going to go through the idea of what a suicide inquiry looks at. And so oftentimes, and this is sort of a typical thing that you're all familiar with working in the schools, as most of you do, you have a very brief pre-screen. And then if people endorse any of those questions, then you pursue it in greater detail. So a lot of times we'll just ask in very general ways, and this is something to think about for COVID, when you're trying to check in with people who are home sheltering and you're just concerned, instead of just launching into, do you want to die? Have you thought about thoughts of dying? And say like, how are things going? What does it feel like to have such isolation from your friends and from your family, all this anxiety, how's your family doing? And if they say things are really rough, then you might have an entree into talking more in detail. So you ask questions like, are you worried a lot? Are you worried about school and how you're going to do? And then that can lead into more direct questions about suicidality. Next question. So these are the 6 questions that you use in the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale. The state and the Office of School and Adolescent Health endorses this measure because it's solidly evidence-based in millions of youth, and it's been normed for adolescents and prepubertal children, unlike a lot of other instruments. So we're going to go into a little bit of detail through all these 6 questions, but here they are summarized. Next slide. So we start with, this is something that I add on myself because I think it's important for you to do as part of your assessment. This is not part of the Columbia Suicide Screen, but I alluded to this earlier, that some risky behaviors with no conscious wish to die may result in death, like that accidental overdose of pain or sleeping pills. Another example I often give is young children who live in very chaotic environments who may step into harm's way, like a busy traffic intersection, or with somebody who has a known history of violence, that they have no intention to die, but they're at very great risk for harming themselves and for dying. Some risky behaviors with a conscious wish to die might not result in death. So again, if I believe that 6 Tylenol will destroy my liver and end up me being dead, where that's part of my belief, I'll only take 6 out of a bottle of 100. It's not to be dismissed because in my mind, I thought that 6 were going to kill me. So what I'm also encouraging you to do is not to get into this binary thing, which we often do. Are they suicidal or are they not? And if they're not suicidal, you go, okay, case closed, not worried. What we really should be looking at is risk. Risk for self-injurious behavior, risk for dying. And so some people consciously wish to die and make sure that that happens. That's suicidal. But some people are in great risk of danger of dying or severely harming themselves and have no suicidality attached to it. So please fold that in to your risk assessment. Next. Now we're going to launch into safety planning. So safety planning is a key part of suicide prevention. And what I would urge all of you to think about is that we teach safety planning to high schoolers who are community gatekeepers, who've had QPR, who've had assist training. We urge high school and middle school students to use safety planning for themselves. This is not an instrument just for therapists. It should be folded into everything that we do. So safety planning is where we start with warning signs. And the warning signs are not what we typically think of as risk and protective factors as professionals. Warning signs is for that person where they say, oh my goodness, I'm really doing badly now. I need to do something. I need to start my safety plan. That precipitates the idea I need to do something different. Just like if I can't go to sleep when I've been really successful at going to sleep and now I stay up for hours, that's a warning sign to me something is wrong. If I'm finding that I'm not interested in whatever it might be that I'm interested in, playing video games, texting for hours with friends, watching stuff on Instagram or on Snapchat, and I'm not interested anymore, that profound loss of interest is something that is warning to me. So that's what we want to identify for that person, what tells them that they're in danger, what tells them that things are getting out of control. It could be that it seems like they're snapping at everybody that they know, that they're rejecting any kind of help or support or friendship. And that's different for them. That's the first step. And then if you look at this, what we start with safety planning is all the things that that person is capable of on their own, so that they don't have to depend on the kindness of strangers or friends, and certainly don't immediately have to depend on professionals. So that's why if we need you, when you're doing safety planning, to go through this scheme, start with how they identify for themselves, not what other people around them tell them that they don't like about what they're doing or are worried about what they're doing, how they are worried for themselves. We're trying to enhance their own sense of self-worth, responsibility, and especially agency, that they have the power to make changes on their own behalf, that it's not hopeless, that they're not worthless, and they're not helpless. Those are the three biggest factors in people feeling desperate: hopelessness, helplessness, worthlessness. So we're trying to shore them up right from the start. So we start with things they can do on their own, then with a friend, just to be around them, not for counseling, not for suggestions, not for advice. And then the next step, if those things don't work, is to tell a friend what's going on and seek counsel from them. If none of those work, then we say, maybe you need a professional, a school guidance counselor, a school nurse, a school social worker, someone out in the community, someone who has some kind of professional training. Then we fold into reducing access from lethal means. And I'll get into that in great detail soon. We always end with, what are the barriers and the challenges to actually doing the safety plan? We don't want to create a plan that they're never going to do. It's like, we tell people who are worried about their weight, oh, join a gym. And they might join a gym and they last for like 2 or 3 days and they never use their membership. That's not a plan that's helpful to them. So if it's more like they have a dog and they walk the dog, and instead of doing it for 10 minutes, you urge them to do it for 20 or 30 minutes to get more exercise in, that is doable. So we're looking at their likelihood of using it, and we always end with, now that we've gone through all of this, what are the major reasons why you want to go on? What are your reasons for living? So our hope about all of this is that we're reducing reasons for dying and maximizing and strengthening reasons for living. Next. So, and keep on flipping through the slides, Felicia, because now you can see what this little obscure slide actually says. So it's basically what I traced you through. You start out with, what are the initial thoughts, feelings, or behaviors that lead into suicidal thinking? Warning signs. What are some techniques that I can do by myself? Who can I call to help distract me? What pleasurable things or neutral things can I do with friends or acquaintances that will get me out of this negative space? Who can I call for help, as far as friends, family, peers, support, and then professionals that I can connect to, including hotlines, etc., and then reducing access to lethal means, sharps locked, guns removed, etc. And then the final point at the bottom, what is the most important thing I need to remember about why I should live? What is my reasons for living? After going through all this. Next. Now we're going to trace through step by step. So the warning signs in surveys that were done by the dialectical behavior team in Washington, looking at all ages, not just adults, but also adolescents and prepubertal adolescents, what they identified for themselves was these 5 major categories of stress and warning signs. Feeling hurt, anguish, misery in their mind, not physical pain, but tortured, desperate. Stress to them meant being pressured or overwhelmed. Agitation was not necessarily physical agitation, but feeling like you have to do something to end this suffering. This cannot continue. I don't know what I'm going to do, but I have to do something. Hopelessness doesn't need an explanation, neither does self-hate, worthlessness. Remember again, hopelessness, worthlessness, helplessness drives self-harm and suicidality. Next slide. So on my own are in 3 different kind of categories. Distraction is a wonderful thing. Distraction is all the things that we do to pull us out of ruminating constantly about all the way in which life sucks. So any way that we can do something that just takes us out of that space, even if it's literally mindless, that's great. So that can be music, helping others. There's a lot of evidence that the best way that people can feel good about themselves is to offer something to someone else. Humor, mindless kind of tasks like counting tasks, repeating, remembering complicated rap lyrics, or writing poetry, games. But as you see here, these are all things that that person can do solitary. It doesn't depend on the availability or the connection with anybody else. Soothing is all the senses. So that could be aromatherapy, taking a long bath. It could be a really good meal. It could be touch. It could be getting a massage, going to a spa, exercising. That's physiological. So it could be exercising, muscle relaxation, deep breathing exercises, a nature walk, a nature meditation, hiking, running. All those things are on my own coping strategies. Next. And then if we're looking at reducing the potential for the use of lethal means, why do we do that at the end of all of this? And that is because what we want to do is build up this repertoire of things that they can do with friends, things that they can do on their own, when they can turn to friends and family, and mentors and teachers and counselors for some kind of counsel, advice, guidance. All the professionals that are there, the hotlines, the text lines, all the ways that they can connect so that they have some hope that here's all the things that they can do. So they're in a better state. They're less hopeless and helpless than they were when we first started to meet with them just a few minutes beforehand. Now is the point to say, so on the times when you do get really desperate and something happens where you feel like the only answer is to hurt yourself, this is why we want to talk about if you have a loaded gun not by the bedside, not easily accessible, if you don't have pills that are going to kill you, that are readily available, and if there's someone caring, knowing you're at risk, to be monitoring you, to be making sure, because if we go through the causes of death from suicide, most people who use a firearm to try to kill themselves die. 80 to 90% of people who use firearms die. The next highest lethality is actually suffocation. So, like we had, unfortunately, in Farmington recently, a lot of people who suicided, who killed themselves, did it by hanging. Now, you can't remove every possible ligature, every possible curtain cord or belt from a home, but you can say that if somebody is at high risk for suicide, they need to be in an environment, whether in an inpatient or residential, or in a caring home that's capable of supervising them to prevent them. That's also part of reducing access to lethal means. Now, why is that so important? And you see that lethality I have at the bottom. One thing I also like to emphasize about this is we're constantly in our training talking about looking at overdose and cutting. Look at the lethality rate. For poisoning and overdose, 2% or less of people who died by a suicide attempt used pills. 1% or less used it by cutting themselves. So if we really want to prevent death, we're not so great at predicting suicide or preventing suicide, but we can prevent people from killing themselves when they are suicidal if we promote gun safety and supervision and monitoring for people who are at risk. That's where we can really do. And so what I'm really hoping is that whenever anybody makes an assessment for suicide, instead of saying, right, you need to be in the hospital, I'm going to refer you to the hospital, or you need to see a therapist, we go further. We do all the safety planning, and we include reducing access to lethal means to plant that structure in their mind and in all the people who care about them, so they can do safety planning wherever they are, wherever they are. And I'm hoping that all of you will be on that bandwagon of encouraging safety planning and reducing access to lethal means. We have initiatives in our state, for instance, to have all emergency room providers and urgent care providers in primary care to look at safety planning and look at especially reducing access to lethal means when they're in the emergency room in hopes of preventing death by firearms, death by hanging and jumping. Next. So this is more about reducing access to lethal means, because a lot of you are unfamiliar with SBIRT. We're going to go through this again. You'll have a copy of all this information in detail about how to pursue this at length. But I wanted to lay the groundwork for that. Next slide. And here's the key factor to know about. Most people are profoundly ambivalent about ending their life. Remember what I said is, if those people who made a fatal or near fatal attempt and survived it, 95% of them say, I'll never do it again. So if they don't have the loaded gun handy, the fatal dose of pills handy, and a way to hang themselves and nobody will discover them, or park themselves in a garage and put the carbon monoxide, pump it into the car, and know that nobody will discover them for a day or two, if they're supervised, and if we look at safety, right, they're only suicidal, the vast majority of people, for minutes or hours, not day after day, week after week. So in that crisis of wanting to die, if there's no way to kill themselves, they might try, but they're not going to die from it. And a lot of times when they're on this search for something to do it with, right, and they're either supervised and stopped, or there's no fatal dose of pills, there's no sharps. And again, even if they use them, pills and sharps don't have a high rate of lethality to them. So we're really focusing in this case about firearm safety. If there's no loaded gun that's handy to them, that they can easily access, by the time they're on the hunt to do something else, that suicidal drive is ebbing, waning. And so they're no longer at acute risk for killing themselves. That's why prevention is so critical. 90% of those who survive a nearly lethal attempt do not go on to die by suicide. Next. So the one thing that's most important to me and worth living for, that's the reasons for living. There's a reasons for living inventory that I've included as part of the references. And in 2 weeks, I and my colleague Laura Rombach, we often present together. We're going to be talking about suicidality specific therapies and go into great detail about how to use reasons for living inventories. But what we're looking at is reasons for living as a coping strategy. And one thing I always like to mention, no matter what the topic is that recovery from anything, a healthcare problem, a mental health care issue, much less suicidality, is having a life of meaning and value and purpose. It's not just reducing symptoms. That's not really a life. If I'm sleeping better, but I have no sense of value or meaning or purpose in my life. So that's what we're trying to instill in people. Hope and restoring them to their sense of purpose and value and meaning. Next. And then, of course, the likelihood of using the safety plan. Next. Here's an app to use with the safety plan. Next. And more about this, next slide. So this is going through the, now we're hitting SBIRT. So we're going to spend the rest of our time talking about that. But before we do, I see that Jill had a question, just wondering where someone might be in terms of suicide risk if they verbalize they're suicidal, but say they have not the guts to do that. So that's wonderful. So if you trace through those 6 questions, I whizzed through them, Jill, because I've spent whole webinars, as Susan and Felicia know, and you can access that, right? At some point, you'll be able to see the recordings if you return to the Head to Toe Kesselman Jones webpage. You'll find the recordings of those. But what you start with is the vague ideas and then the intent. So what you're talking about is they have the ideas, but they don't have the intent yet, right? And what they're saying is they're profoundly ambivalent about it. So that's a relatively low risk, right? When they say they don't have the guts to do it, what they're saying is, and actually one of the most, the biggest protective factors against suicide is feeling that there's something shameful about suicide, that it's too risky, like you could take an overdose and end up being paraplegic and survive and have a miserable life, as opposed to really maximizing your loss of suffering. You're actualizing, maximizing your suffering itself. So that's a great question. But if you have further questions after you've looked through that framework, please let me know. Thanks, Jill. Hope I answered your question. So as far as SBIRT, it's this acronym for screening, brief intervention, and referral to treatment. There's many different ways of doing this, but the idea for the screening is what we call a universal screen, which I know that all of you use in the schools, right? Like you use the Healthy Lifestyle Questionnaire, the PHQ-9, whatever your measure is. What that means is, and this is what we did in the SBIRT grants that we had in the state in primary care. The traditional path for identifying substance abuse or mental health is that the person who's being seen brings it up themselves. I have a problem with this. Or the provider gets some idea that that person may have a problem with alcohol or may seem overly depressed or whatever, and then they initiate the conversation. Universal screens means I show up for a sprained ankle in urgent care, and they routinely ask me, how am I doing? How am I sleeping? How hopeful am I about the future? So I've had several people during my assessment tell me they would not kill themselves because they didn't want to put their family through. Yes, Sandra is pointing out that that's, again, one of the most protective factors, is because if you're looking selfishly at yourself, then you feel like that's the best way to end your suffering, but you won't do it because you wouldn't want to burden your family with it. Or because if you suicide in some religions, some spiritual traditions, some communities, your family is not allowed to mourn you. They can't bury you. They can't have a service for you because you're a suicide. It brings shame and misery to all of those who follow you in your family. That's a huge disincentive. Thanks for underscoring that, Sandra. Back to SBIRT. So you can see that from a public health prevention, remember that previous information I gave to you, that the majority of people who end up killing themselves do not see a mental health professional and have not been identified by anyone as having a severe mental illness or suicidality. They see primary care for another reason. They go to the emergency room for another reason. Okay. So that's why universal screening and pre-screening is so important. That's why we want to do it in all of our schools for youth. We want to do it in primary care. We want to do it in all sorts of settings. That's the whole purpose, basically, of teaching people youth mental health first aid, QPR, is how to identify warning signals in people that we care about and to introduce that conversation of, I'm really concerned. You seem to be pushing everybody away, including me. Is something going on that I should know about? That's again this idea. Brief intervention is a 5 to 15-minute intervention using motivational interviewing principles to say, so in the examples that Jill gave and Sandra gave, where they say, I am suicidal, but I don't have the guts to do that, to motivate them to say, that's really great that there's a part of you that doesn't want to kill yourself. But, it sounds like that sometimes those ideas do come through your head and you're sort of worried about whether or not you might go through with it at some point in time. Would you be interested in doing something about that? That's the brief intervention. So if you express this part and this part, remember that all these screens are self-report. They're not the intuition of the provider. That person for themselves identifies a problem. So the brief intervention is basically a way for you to look at the ambivalence that they're having and what they're motivated to do. Very much connected with motivational interviewing is the stages of change theory that I think a lot of you have been exposed to: pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, action, maintenance. So if we're looking at our suicide inquiry, right, we talk about pre-contemplation. I don't even think of wanting to die or wanting to end my life or not wake up tomorrow morning because life is so tough. Well, I'm beginning to think about that, but I don't really think I want to die. Well, I'm thinking that that's the only way out. So I'm moving from pre-contemplation to contemplation. Then I'm saying, it's getting to the point where I'm thinking I might want to do something about that. Maybe I should think about, I wonder, my dad uses guns. I wonder if he leaves them at home, if they have firearms about it. So I'm starting to prepare, right? And then the action is when I rehearse it, when I plan for it, when I actually make my attempt. So that's the scheme. Brief intervention is hopefully saying, now that you're contemplating this, maybe even preparing for it, what's the side of you that says, don't act on those thoughts? Don't go through with it. How do we speak to that? Again, how do we speak to your reasons for living that are there? And it might be because I'll be a burden to my family, or I'll be ostracized as far as my memories from my family, and my family will be ostracized by their religious and spiritual community. Those are all parts that say, maybe I shouldn't go through with this. That's what the brief intervention is intended to do. Next slide. The referral to treatment is obviously, if someone is motivated to pursue things, right, who do we offer them? And in this case, we have to be really, really smart about this, because there's a lot of people in our state who are licensed behavioral health providers who say, I'm not trained in, or have the capacity to, or have the interest in treating anybody who's in crisis or is at risk for dying. I don't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole. So to just give them that name, or to give them the name of a therapist who says, my practice is closed for the foreseeable future. We have to give referrals to people who will take on people who are in crisis, have the tools to handle that, know how to do safety planning, know how to do treatment interventions, like Laura and I will talk about in 2 weeks, that are specifically focused on reducing suicidality, and that have access to them, that they're affordable, that their insurance pays for it. If they don't have insurance, they'll accept them because they take Medicaid, et cetera, et cetera. So we want to be really mindful. And I hear from all sorts of you all the time about people will get referred to an emergency room and they'll say, you don't need to be in the hospital, bye. And then the parents don't know what to do. The school doesn't know what to do, much less the youth themselves has no guidance. Or they're given a phone number of a hotline, or they're given the phone number of a therapist or an agency, and the agency says, I'm sorry, we don't take your insurance. I'm sorry, we don't have anybody available. I'm sorry, in my practice, I don't treat anybody who needs crisis intervention. So that's the key, making a well-informed referral. And there's a tradition in SBIRT called the warm handoff. The warm handoff is, I don't just give you a phone number. I might make the phone call with you. I might, if that person is in a building away from my office, it's like if a teacher notices a problem, sometimes they may walk the student to the guidance counselor, or the guidance counselor or social worker may walk them over to the school-based health center if that's relatively close. So it's following up in the moment, and it's really important. If we're motivating someone to seek help, and then we say essentially, well, now you're on your own, that's not really helpful. So what we're doing is putting our money where our mouth is, saying, we're really concerned about you, we're really caring, we're going to pursue. So that's the framework of SBIRT, the screening, the assessment, and then if you see somebody who's identified themselves as being at risk, having the tools to talk them through, to motivate them to the part of them that wants to help themselves, and then giving them a good referral. Another part of that is the brief therapies that we talked about. Next slide. So now I go into the detail of that. I've given you the framework for that. You know that you can refer to the slides. Next slide. So one example of that screen is that Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale that I gave. That's a normed SBIRT screen for suicidality and suicide assessment. Here's a whole list of other screens that have been normed for youth to look at substance abuse, nicotine dependence, risk drinking in pregnant girls and women, etc. Next slide. Because as we know, substance abuse is highly associated with suicidality. More about the brief intervention and the techniques for that. Next slide. Some basic frameworks about motivational interviewing, which is one of the gifts of New Mexico to the world, motivational interviewing. And I know that Head to Toe and a lot of places, including the webinar series that I connect to at UNM, offer lots of training throughout the state about motivational interviewing. So I'm not going to go into the detail here. Next slide. But these are giving you some of the frameworks of motivational interviewing for those of you who are new to that. Next slide. And then how to relate this to SBIRT. You can see we have a pre-screen. How you doing? What's going on? PHQ-9. We have the screen, the Columbia Suicide Severity screen, using motivational interviewing for 5 minutes to find out, are they motivated to use the safety plan? Are they motivated to see somebody if they've identified that they have? The warm handoff, next slide, to the referral to treatment. And the roles for peer and community supporters in knowing how to do the safety plan, in knowing how to refer to people who can do a more detailed assessment. They're helping that brief intervention, that motivating people to seek help. Next slide. More about peer and community supports. Next slide. Again, about helping them understand the framework for safety planning. Next slide. About these suicidality treatments, which again, we're going to have a whole webinar on, Laura and I, 2 weeks from today. Same time, same station, same wonderful people at Kess Jones to support us. Next slide. Again, I always like to end these things with life worth living. And finally, next slides, more information about me. Again, my office phone number, and more importantly, my email. Next. And just to let you know, lots of references for you. Now, finally, we're going to have, Felicia's going to step in to make sure you understand how to get your continuing education credits and certificates of completion. Then we'll stop the recording And for those of you who are interested in staying on, I'd love to chat with you. We have at least 15 minutes where we can talk with each other. And again, you can either type it in the chat or you can unmute yourselves and we can talk. And if you would need to depart as soon as Felicia's done, so you know what to do with your CEs, and you don't want to stay for the Q&A, and you don't want to participate in that, you can always email me, and I'm more than happy to be a resource for you.